super awesome, by the way, and I'm really honored to be here, and thank you for having me. This has been really cool. So, I am going to tell you about one of my weird obsessions. I am so glad that Sarah swore in hers, because I get to call this by its actual title then, Great Assholes in Science History. So I really like people who have contributed greatly to science despite or perhaps because of their tremendous character flaws. I think it tells us something. So I'm going to tell you about one of my favorite characters. You can go ahead and...
Do you want the notes on that?
What's that?
Do you want the speaker note?
Nah, I should be good.
Cool.
And we can go, we're going to talk about John Cleves Sims Jr., who is, let's go ahead one slide forward already. I jumped the gun. This guy. So, in 1818, he sent 500 copies of a pamphlet to everyone who was anyone in the scientific world. Societies, governments, universities, and in it he wrote, "To all the world, I declare that the earth is hollow and habitable within." And let's get once more. And next slide, boom. This is the statement that he sent. So it's hollow, it's habitable within, and he asked for 100 brave companions to go with him on a polar exploration to find these holes at the North and South Poles that will lead us into this inner world. He attached to his thesis a certificate of his sanity. Surprisingly, the scientific establishment was not persuaded. He was not daunted. He proceeded to go on a public tour. He wrote letters, he debated in newspapers, he did lectures, all talking about his 5 concentric spheres inside the Earth. And people listened, and he actually persuaded some people. He was an incredibly brilliant person. He was not like a total random crackpot. He was actually very smart. He was able to synthesize a wide range of natural phenomena to explain this theory. And so as he got believers, people actually even started agitating for the government to fund his expedition. For context, this is just after the War of 1812, which is where the United States invaded Canada. We got our asses kicked there. At the end of the war, everything kind of resets back to where it was, except for the British burnt down the White House. And somehow, in this war, we come out of this with like huge national fervor, like USA, sort of crazy bad stuff. The national anthem came out of this war, and this idea that the United States deserves a leading role on the global stage in all fields, including scientific endeavors. So this polar exploration idea caught on in a way that I can only compare to the space race of the 20th century. This sort of exotic frontier paired with fervent nationalism, right? And so he begins to gather followers, like Jeremiah Reynolds, who has a big influence on literature, writing Mocha Dick, which influenced Moby Dick, and some other stuff. But what we care about for this is that he's the PR guy who figures out that if you really want to succeed, no offense to anyone from the Midwest, but if you really want to make this happen, you need to get out of the Midwest and go to the East Coast to get money and persuade politicians and people. So they go on this lecture tour together. So these huge crowds, and people go there to laugh at them, but then they leave thinking maybe they're onto something. But on this tour, Sims dies. And this is his memorial in Ohio, and yes, that is a hollow earth globe at the top of it. You can go see this today. But Reynolds carries on the legacy, and he continues to fight for this expedition. It pays off after 10 brutal years of politicking and fighting and getting marooned by on Chile, I think is where he was abandoned. But anyway, Congress finally approves this Wilkes expedition. It just goes around the world. It's almost 4 years long. And it just unearths a giant treasure trove of scientific data. It forms the basis of the Smithsonian Institution, and it discovers the continent of Antarctica. Because this expedition at this point is no longer about finding the Sims holes at the poles, because Reynolds, PR guy that he was, figured out that you only needed to appeal to commerce and science and national pride to get the public whipped up. You didn't need this controversial hollow earth portion. So he quietly cuts that. But the influence, this is a great quote by a geologist, the influence on the development and public funding of institutional science was direct from Sims' influence. This expedition established the United States as a major research and expedition power. And it established a precedent for federal support for scientific exploration and research. if anyone in here works for an institution that receives federal funding, or if you've ever received an NSF grant, you owe it to this fucking nutter. There's really a direct chain between this guy and your funding. So, there's another problem, though. There's a contradiction. Sims is also pioneering in the tactics of bypassing the scientific establishment by using what was popular media at the time to sell people and thereby win his funding. And this is from a Flat Earth conference last year. He's kind of a pioneer in these techniques. So I think that inherent contradiction between Sims as like the pioneer for federal funding for science and his legacy as a crackpot who bypassed the scientific establishment is kind of informative about modern day Americans' relationship with science.
Whew.
5 minutes!
Now we have time for questions.
Hi, yes.
So, so why did Sims think that the Earth was hollow? Like, where did he get this idea to begin with? Like, and what evidence did he use to kind of get people on board?
Super great question. So there are people who had this theory sort of before Halley, Edward Halley of Halley Comet fame. Certainly, I want to say like 60, 70 years before him. Sims flatly denies that he encountered any of these previous theories. He's representative of what I want to call like pioneer science. He's like the super American frontier guy, what was the frontier then, who's like got a few books and he's got his own observational wit and he's putting all this together as he's synthesizing data from like encyclopedias, essentially. So it's very debatable whether he had picked this up from previous theorists. As to how he constructs this argument, oh man, so it's absolutely unreadable. And nonsensical. So the science at which he's drawing from was flawed at the time, or his particular interpretation of the science is deeply flawed. And then on top of that, you have this really weird, 19th century language that is incredibly polysyllabic expositions about the relevance of textual and it's just like, it's very hard to actually understand how he drew those conclusions using original materials. But essentially, he took every single thing he could get his hands on, from geologic explorations to reindeer migration patterns to you name it. Yes?
Was his theory disproven during his lifetime? And if so, did he retract the theory?
So he died...
Like Fox News-ish?
No, it would be awesome. No. He died 12 years before the Wilkes expedition, which discovered the continent of Antarctica. He never got to see any of this exploration happen. The Wilkes expedition didn't disprove this, but it also wasn't looking for it. By this time, it had kind of fallen out of favor. Hollow Earth fell out of favor at the time and became replaced by polar ocean sort of theory, this idea that warm water sort of rises up at the poles and it melts the ice caps and you actually have nice like saunas there. And then like it goes to, Hitler escaped into the Hollow Earth and the UFOs are actually Nazi aircraft. So it goes through a bunch of iterations and it's not until polar explorers actually get to the poles that it's sort of definitively disproved. Yeah.
In your opinion, did he do it in good faith? Did he believe it?
Absolutely, he did it in good faith. He fervently believed in this. Every single person who met him, who wrote about them, there's these great letters you can see, basically says really good things about this person. He's very likable, he's very smart. It's just when you touch on this one line of conversation that he like just gets super animated and wrapped up. But it was in good faith. One thing that I think is really interesting to note about Sims relative to other sort of crackpot science theories is he didn't believe that there was a conspiracy against him. He didn't believe that the scientific process was flawed. He felt his failure to persuade the scientific community was a failure of his own ability to put together the evidence or to persuade the scientific community, which is just incredibly humble for a crazy pants person. So I think that's really Let's go. Yes?
This is uncle.
His uncle, oh god, it got really confusing for a while. I don't remember the details. He was, I want to say, a state senator who then went on to a federal office, but they both have exactly the same name, and so when you're tracing the threads, it can get a little confusing. Yes.
Who were the Russians in all of this? You said it was like a space race. Who are they competing against?
That is a very good question. So there were all the global powers at the time were still involved in exploration of the oceans for a couple reasons. One is all these powers were trying to develop better charts for the Asia-Europe or Asia-Americas trade routes. So charting was a huge thing, and with charting and with ports and bays and all that comes power. So everybody's doing this. Second is, it cannot be understated how valuable whale and seals were. This is like the golden age of spermaceti being like liquid gold. It was just incredibly valuable stuff. So all the major powers were in kind of an exploration race still at this late period of time. Can we squeeze in one more?
Yeah. Can you give like the sort of historical context of where the scientific method is at this point? Because I know like later than this period, there's still stuff that's totally considered legitimate science that we now consider to be just ridiculous.
Yeah. Okay. I'm not totally qualified to answer that exactly. Actually, I'm not even remotely qualified to answer that. What I can do is contextualize American perceptions of science and how that sort of evolved and why this is also important for another reason. So this is like a total shocker, but America kind of has this whole strain of anti-intellectualism and anti-science from its very beginning. So the reason it took 10 goddamn years for this expedition to get funded is, one, it was a logistical nightmare and no one wanted to touch it and was passing it off. The other is there's literally congressional testimony in the record where congressmen are like, this is stupid. Basic science it has nothing to do with our interests. This violates states' rights. It's after the expedition, there's this like great passage where the Southern congressman says like, $6,000. What do they need? I'm sorry to any Southerners, but it really was Southerners who were the problem here. $6,000 to show drawings of bugs and frogs, etc. And that's his exact words: bugs, frogs, etc. And he's dismissing the value of this enterprise. But anyone who's here, like works in biology at the Cal Academy, you can totally boo that, because we still kind of deal with this today. So in American science at the time, there's this really strong rejection of European theory crafting. This idea that you can use analogous reasoning to take small phenomenon and build a bigger theoretical structure. And America really rejects that, and they bring it back to science that will make money, can be commercialized, and science that is purely observational. You see a frog, you describe what the frog looks like, put the specimen in a jar, and you don't build a theory as to why it shares traits with other frogs or anything like that. So one of the things that's really interesting about Sims is on his lectures, he goes and a bunch of scientists go out and see him, and 10 to 20 years later, these same scientists who see him doing this grand theory building start to lay out a framework in American science to return to grand theory construction, this idea that you can use analogous reasoning to draw bigger conclusions. So I think, does that kind of sort of get at what you're going at? All right.
Well, on that note, let's give him a big round of applause.